damn bananas here.
Hey guys, welcome back. We're finally here on part 4 of this 4-part series of the Hong Kong New Wave directors that Jean-Claude Van Damme first worked with. They had the first US produced film with Van Damme, of course. Similar to part 3, part 4 is going to be with Tsui Hark, but this time the film Knockoff. This is an interesting double box set, by the way, because on one end you get Knockoff, and on the other you have Nowhere to Run, which this critic says it's the best Van Damme film to date. I don't know if I'd go that far, but it's pretty good, and I'll do a future video on that. But I thought this pairing, this box set, was interesting because Knockoff and Nowhere to Run, neither one of these are the typical Van Damme movie, especially from the 90s, so it was just interesting to pair those together. But anyway, in today's video, it's all about Knockoff, so let's get to it. I remember when I first seen Knockoff in the theater. The opening seemed cheap and low budget, but at least the rest of the film didn't share that same cheap quality to it. It wasn't really a good first impression, though. But now that I think about it, and I'm probably thinking too much into this, but maybe they tried to initially give the fill-in impression that this film itself was a knockoff, a cheap imitation of what we usually expect out of a theatrical release Van Damme film. Look at the opening title, for example. Now compare it to something like Hard Target. I'm probably overthinking it. Speaking of overthinking it, I do want to point out this really interesting article that someone posted a link to on one of my other Van Damme videos, and I'll put that link in the video description below. The article is titled, The Underrated Insanity of Tsui Hark and Jean-Claude Van Damme's Knockoff. Just to quickly summarize the article, it really just breaks down how and why the movie Knockoff is actually quite genius. I think a lot of people would categorize it as so bad it's good, myself included. But I just recently watched it again prior to making this video. I definitely appreciate it more now than when it came out. Van Damme and Rob Schneider actually had pretty good on-screen chemistry together. Apparently they, along with co-star Lela Rochon, would spend time together around Hong Kong when they weren't shooting the film, so they really got a good chance to get to know one another.
Jean-Claude and Rob and I, we all go out because we're sort of playing this trio, you know, and we really got to know each other and have fun and enjoy Hong Kong.
And this bond they developed translates well into the film. As far as the co-stars go, Rob Schneider really put a lot of thought into developing his character.
I think that the CIA was challenging, but I think he found the fashion industry more exciting.
Actually, he seems to play the exact same guy in everything he does, which is fine, because he does manage to provide some pretty good comic relief here. That'll make you chuckle.
This is obviously between you two, so if you can aim at him.
Which is great, since we couldn't get anything nearly as amusing out of Dennis Rodman in Double Team.
Oops, airball.
Some of Van Damme's lines feel stilted and forced, though.
Eddie! Hey, Chrome Dome. Just back from Tokyo, huh? You son of a bitch.
While others are played quite well.
His brother is the biggest mobster in Hong Kong.
He's not his brother, that's his cousin. Just stop being an old lady.
Speaking of Van Damme's lines, and I'm referring to the white powdery ones now, there's actually an interesting dichotomy going on here with how intense he is at times.
There were nanobombs!
It's contrasted with how laid back and relaxed he is throughout the film. The funny thing is that it totally works for this movie. At the same time, I'm not sure if he could have pulled it off if he wasn't on coke. This film was made during the time Van Damme was known to be riding the so-called White Dragon. In fact, Van Damme has even suggested that he was so coked out at the time, he doesn't even remember filming Knockoff. People tend to be very talkative and energetic in that state. I don't think his performance would have been quite the same otherwise. While the film never alluded to his actual character, Marcus Ray, as being a cokehead, I don't think it'd be too far-fetched to imagine a guy in the fashion industry who has ties to counterfeit products and Hong Kong gangsters to be involved with drugs. So, in a weird way, his addiction at that time in his own life, although negative and destructive overall, actually benefited his role in this movie in my opinion. With that said, I of course wish he never got involved with that lifestyle because he was always a role model to me, and I'm sure millions of others, and it did actually end up hurting his career. But at the end of the day, nobody's perfect, and I've always just decided to focus on all those positive things he's done, which still makes him someone to cheer for and be inspired by. As far as Lela Rochon goes, she was a pretty big star in the 90s, and outside of Knockoff, you'd probably recognize her in Waiting to Exhale. Interesting trivia is that both Jean-Claude Van Damme and Lela Rochon both appeared in the 1984 movie Breakin'. This was the first Hollywood movies both actors first appeared in. They had small roles as background dancers and were uncredited. How cool is it though that 14 years later, they'd be the stars in this large Hollywood production. Knockoff had a $35 million budget, by the way. Jet Li was actually supposed to play a role in this one too, as a character Inspector Han, but he turned it down last minute in order to do Lethal Weapon 4. That ended up being a great career choice on his part, as Lethal Weapon 4 was such a huge hit, unlike Knockoff. It really ended up doing a great job of introducing American audiences to Jet Li, which would lead to a string of lead roles in Hollywood productions during the early 2000s. That'll be the subject of a future video, by the way. As far as Knockoff's director goes, Tsui Hark is widely regarded as a pioneer in Hong Kong action cinema. After having made his first US-produced film Double Team with Jean-Claude Van Damme, which he shot in Europe, mainly Belgium, France, and Rome, he longed to return to his native Hong Kong, where he could make a film in the raw style he was used to. Now, I do want to point out that Tsui Hark was unsatisfied with the lack of creative control he had when making Double Team. This lack of creative control was a complaint that Zhao Mu had as well when working on Hard Target with Van Damme, claiming that in Hong Kong, the director is everything. Van Damme said, "When you are making a film in Hong Kong, people are more focused on getting the job done, and all trivial politics that exist on a Hollywood set are thrown out the window. There is no complaining on the set, and the crew is efficient and hardworking with non-stop endurance." It definitely seemed like with his second outing with Van Damme, Tsui Hark had a lot more creative control than he did with their previous effort, Double Team. This is evident in the overall look and feel of Knockoff, which is definitely not something US audiences would have been accustomed to seeing, outside of fans who just happen to be exposed to those types of films. Knockoff, like much of Hong Kong cinema, was highly energetic and highly imaginative. Take for instance the scene where Van Damme and Rob Schneider had to escape his fruit warehouse. Like the movie Double Team before this, we have to give credit to Hong Kong superstar and director Sammo Hung for choreographing the fights in this one. He also worked as a film's second unit director. One of my favorite fights in particular was a scene in the parking garage here. Now, Knockoff would be the third Van Damme film that took place in Hong Kong, the first being Bloodsport, of course, and the second, Double Impact. But Knockoff would be the only one of the three that made you feel like you were a part of Hong Kong as opposed to merely a visitor. A lot of this has to do with Tsui Hark's direction.
I try to make this camera movement as free as possible. Maybe it's because of the environment, the space in Hong Kong is very narrow and very small, so it would give us a kind of lunatic tendency of going through everything to set our vision free from the restriction.
Speaking of camera work, Tsui Hark really does a great job at framing several of the shots to help enhance and invoke more emotion out of a scene. Take this shot for example when Van Damme and Schneider are about to be chastised by Lela Rochon's character, a company representative sent in to help straighten up the business. She's really got them by the neck. And when the actual chastising begins, look how much larger and powerful she becomes as we see them from her point of view. There are a lot more interesting and somewhat bizarre, borderline questionable, but at least visually appealing shots throughout the film, such as this point of view shot from the foot, and this interior of a knockoff shoe coming apart at the seams here. There's also a shot of a bullet through a soup can here. If there's one thing you're going to get from Knockoff, it's definitely going to be a unique visual experience. Tsui Hark is truly a great visual storyteller, which should be no surprise since his first foray into filmmaking was with experimental films. Van Damme and Tsui Hark working together again would only be one of a number of notable professional reunions on this film. For example, Tsui Hark would re-team with producer and wife at the time, Nan Sun Shi. The husband and wife team previously made 1985's Shanghai Blues, an award-winning film that had been screened in over 20 international film festivals. Van Damme would re-team with screenwriter Stephen E. D'Souza on Knockoff as well, which is a guy who wrote and made his directorial debut with Van Damme on the movie Street Fighter a few years prior to this. Stephen E. D'Souza established his reputation as a writer who could juggle both action and humor. He's one of only a handful of screenwriters whose films have earned over $2 billion at the box office. Some of the more notable films he's written, a little film you may have heard of, Die Hard, as well as its sequel, Die Hard 2. He also wrote Commando and The Running Man, of course, with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and 1995's Judge Dredd with Sylvester Stallone, which Rob Schneider also played a sidekick in that one as well. Stephen E. D'Souza once told a magazine writer that he could die then and there, and you probably wouldn't know for 2 years because there were so many projects that were going to be released that still had his name. That's no longer the case these days though, as it looks like his last project was all the way back in 2012, a TV pilot called Spyburbia. In case you're wondering, he did not die in 2010 by the way. As far as Knockoff goes, the title is a double entendre. It refers both to counterfeit goods as well as a targeted killing. I'm sure you all have your fun knockoff counterfeit story, and I'll share mine real quick. When I was in middle school, starter sports gear was all the rage. It was expensive though. But luckily for me, my dad was stationed in Korea at the time, and he had a source, straight from the factory, where he could get this stuff for cheap. Well, It was cheap in more ways than one. Anyway, I thought I finally had something cool to wear and I'd win over my peers with, but instead I was made aware of counterfeit goods and suddenly those clothes weren't so cool. This was the 90s, by the way, so it's not like this was common knowledge, especially for somebody in middle school. There was no internet, there was no way to look up any of this stuff. It's truly the dark ages. How did we live back then? I mean, there's no record of it, at least online. And you know what they say, if it's not on Facebook, it never happened. As far as the actual movie goes, let's ask Van Damme what it's about.
It's like 48 hours in Hong Kong with a Chinese flavor and a great guy.
On second thought, let's ask Rob Schneider instead.
Like Die Hard in a skyscraper. Wait a second, Die Hard wasn't a skyscraper.
I'll just tell you what it's about.
It's about life.
You had your chance, Van Damme. I'm gonna tell him now. Van Damme essentially plays a fashion designer who has to team up and join forces with the CIA in order to combat terrorism by way of circumventing the placement of nanobombs within counterfeit products that are shipped worldwide.
There were nanobombs!
If you think that storyline sounds a little out there, remember in his previous effort, Double Team, Jean-Claude Van Damme was fighting Mickey Rourke in a Roman Coliseum while a tiger's on the loose and there are landmines, and Dennis Rodman was on a motorcycle. Here's an interesting side note, by the way. Van Damme actually briefly played a fashion designer in real life. In 2001, he had his own clothing line called Damage 7, exclusively at high-end London retailer Harrods. The clothing line was full of energy and vibrant colors, much like the movie Knockoff itself. There are green explosive flames in this movie for some reason. Knockoff was set against the handover of Hong Kong to China, and was shot during the actual return itself, a highly unusual example of fact-meeting fiction. Hong Kong was under British rule from 1841 to 1997, by the way. Producer Nansen Shi said, "It was incredibly exciting to be in Hong Kong during this amazingly historical time with the changeover happening right in the middle of our shooting schedule. We were thrilled and honored to be the only Western film allowed to shoot in Hong Kong while the territory was in such transition." Jean-Claude Van Damme is quoted as saying, "The combination of Knockoff in Hong Kong is like Blade Runner on Earth." Wait a minute. Blade Runner takes place on Earth? I'm just as confused as Arsenio Hall was in this totally unrelated but amusing interview clip. Pay special close attention to his reaction, by the way.
If you have all those children and you don't tell them the truth about real life and you hide them in a rosy world, it can be very dangerous for them later. They have to know if they go in downtown LA with money in their hands and showing that, we can have some trouble. So you have to teach your children to go to some place and not to go to some place. It's so simple.
Yes, you're a regular E.E. Cummings.
Like Maximum Risk, Van Damme was up against the Russian mob in Knockoff. While Maximum Risk also had crooked FBI agents, this one had crooked CIA agents. But that's where the similarities end. While Ring of Lamb's Maximum Risk was more realistic and gritty, Knockoff, like Tsui Hark's previous effort with Van Damme and Double Team, is just over the top zany. Ring of Lamb has been described as the Martin Scorsese of Asia, while Tsui Hark is fantastical and described as the Spielberg of Asia by everyone except Jean-Claude Van Damme.
Tsui is more like the George Lucas of Asia. You know what I'm saying? More fantasy.
Film critic and Van Damme cheerleader Kevin Thomas of the Los Angeles Times called Knockoff Van Damme's best film to date and said it has crossover appeal due to its humor. However, despite Kevin's glowing endorsement, Knockoff ended up being a dud at the box office. With the poor performance of Knockoff as well as Van Damme's prior film Double Team, his next project, Legionnaire, wasn't even given a theatrical release. Instead, it debuted straight to video, which was unheard of for a Van Damme release at the time. Van Damme would get another shot at box office glory soon after in 1999 with Universal Soldier: The Return, which I remember seeing in the theater, but was disappointed. As much as I wanted to like the film and support Van Damme and see him succeed, hoping he'd continue his theatrical run, it just wasn't any good. The director was a stunt coordinator for one, and the film felt more like a video game. The original Universal Soldier was excellent, by the way, directed by a real filmmaker, Roland Emmerich. This is a guy who'd give us huge blockbusters like Independence Day with Will Smith, for example. The original Universal Soldier did a great job of weaving in an interesting plot in its sci-fi action package, sprinkled in a little humor, and even humanized Van Damme's brought back to life automaton super soldier character. Overall, you could really say the late 90s was the end of an amazing era. With the 1-2 punch of Knockoff and Universal Soldier: The Return, Van Damme's career would never be the same. But it wasn't just Van Damme who was falling off. Audiences were losing interest in all the big names that ruled the action genre in the 80s and 90s. Steven Skull movies were starting to go straight to video, for example. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone would last a little bit longer in theaters, but not much. Stallone kept on working at it and gave us straight-to-video releases such as I See You, Avenging Angelo, and Shade. He would of course finally be able to emerge from this straight-to-video slump in the 2006's amazing Rocky Balboa. Leave it to Rocky, the great underdog, to give Stallone the comeback he needed. Arnold clearly seen the writing on the wall and decided to take a different route altogether. Instead of being consigned to straight-to-video purgatory, he decided to rule the great state of California instead and became its governor. He would of course later re-emerge back in theaters once Stallone got audiences reinterested in these action icons again by dusting them off the shelf and making the ultimate action fan's dream project, The Expendables, in 2010. Van Damme would of course get his chance to re-shine in theaters worldwide with his role as the villain in the sequel to The Expendables in 2012. It was a brief reminder of what audiences had in the 90s, and it was a real treat to see Van Damme and Stallone battle it out, mano a mano.
I'll man you up.
But let's not stray too far off course, as this could be a topic for an entirely different video. What I want to know is, what do you honestly think about Knockoff? Let me know in the comments below.